basic salary, HRA or house rent allowance will generally be the second largest component of your entire salary structure. Now this component is basically self-explanatory in its name, that it is an allowance that is given to you to compensate for the house rental expense that you would incur as an employee. When you are paid a certain amount as an HRA, you can claim that entire amount as tax-free, subject to the limits mentioned in the Income Tax Act, which is directly related to the actual rent expense that you may have during the course of your employment. To help you understand this, the total amount of deduction that you get as a house rent allowance is minimum of the actual HRA received, 40 or 50% of the basic, and actual rent paid minus 10% of basic. While this is the rule, let's take up an example of Rocket Singh to help you explain this in a much better manner. So when you look at the payslip of Rocket Singh, you see that he is being paid an HRA of 25,000 rupees each month. This HRA is equal to 50% of his basic salary. So the limit 1 that you arrive at is the actual HRA is 25,000, and the limit 2 is 50% of his basic, which is again 25,000 rupees. The third limit that determines the amount of deduction that he can claim against his HRA. If Rocket Singh is paying an amount of 35,000 as his rent, then the third limit is computed as 35,000, that is actual rent paid, minus 10% of his basic, which is 10% of 50,000, that's 5,000 rupees. So the third deduction that he gets is an amount of 30,000 rupees. The deduction that is available under law is the minimum of first, second and third. So in this case, the deduction which Rocket Singh will get is an amount of 25,000, which is the minimum of the three limits that we have just computed. The idea here is that Rocket Singh is getting a HRA of 25,000. He cannot claim a deduction which is larger than 25,000. His deduction will always be limited to the maximum of the HRA that he receives. Now, what do I mean when I say that he can claim a deduction of 25,000? This means that he is being paid an amount of 25,000 as HRA by his employer. Since he is actually paying an amount of 35,000 as rent every month, he can submit the same to his employer. He can give his rent agreement, he can give the details of his landlord like the PAN card, etc. to his employer. And what the employer will do is, he will allow that submission and allow that deduction to the extent of limit that we just computed, that is up to 25,000 per month, and his HRA will be taxed to the extent of 25,000, that is HRA received, minus the deduction that is available, which again coincidentally here was 25,000. So the total amount that will be taxable out of his total HRA would be an amount of 0. So the entire HRA component becomes tax-free in the hands of Rocket Singh. An amount of 25,000 per month translates to an amount of 3 lakh rupees per year. So out of his earnings of 12 lakh rupees per annum, which are potentially taxable, he gets a deduction of 3 lakh rupees, and only the balance 9 lakhs will get taxed, because this 3 lakhs is something which he was paid in the form of house rent allowance, and he used that money by paying for the rent of the property that he was staying at. Because he used it for the purpose it was given, it became completely tax-free in his hands. And that is how all the various components that we will discuss, which are part of the potentially taxable components, work, where I spend the money for the purpose I am given. That particular money, or the money subject to the limit that is prescribed in my Income Tax Act, becomes completely tax-free in my hands. A commonly asked question is that what happens if I stay with my parents and pay a rent to my parents? Can I claim a HRA deduction for the rent that I pay to my parents? Now the Income Tax Act clearly says that you are allowed to pay rent to your parents as long as your parents are showing it as an income in their return. You are perfectly on the right path if you are paying a rent to your parents. While paying a rent to your parents is allowed, paying rent to your spouse is not allowed, right? What the Income Tax Act clearly distinguishes between the two by saying that paying a rent to a spouse and trying to claim that as a deduction in your income tax is not as per the ethics of the law that has been laid out.